It was a night like no other. The snowstorm came suddenly, engulfing the entire mountainside in a thick, swirling blanket of white. The winds howled, trees groaned under the weight of the snow, and visibility dropped to near zero. In the heart of this chaos, 4 young children wandered, lost, cold, and utterly terrified. Their tiny footprints were quickly swallowed by the storm, as if nature itself wanted to erase any trace of them. But despite the cold biting at their skin, they kept moving, driven by a desperate hope that someone, anyone, might find them. Meanwhile, high above the snow-covered landscape, in the warmth of his luxurious cabin, James Thornton sat sipping his evening coffee, staring out into the storm. Thornton wasn't just any man. He was a billionaire, a self-made tycoon whose wealth could buy him anything. He owned the land, the forests, and the mountains that surrounded his estate. Yet tonight, something was different. There was an unease in the air, a sense that something was terribly wrong. As the fire crackled in the fireplace behind him, Thornton's eyes narrowed. His gut told him to check outside. But what could possibly be out there in such a brutal storm? James had always been a man of instinct. It was what had built his empire. He'd learned early on to trust that inner voice that warned him when things didn't feel right. Tonight was no different. Without a second thought, he grabbed his heavy coat, boots, and gloves, heading for the door. The storm was fierce, but something inside him told him to push through. Something, or someone, needed his help. Out in the blinding snow, the children were losing hope. Sarah, the eldest, was barely 12, yet she held her little brother's hand tightly, trying to stay strong for him. Her younger sister, Emma, was sobbing quietly, her small face red from the cold, while their cousin Lucas tried to shield them from the wind with his jacket. They had no idea where they were, or how they'd ended up so far from home. All they knew was that they couldn't stop now. They had to keep walking, even if their bodies screamed for warmth, for shelter. Just when it seemed like they couldn't take another step, a set of headlights appeared through the blizzard, cutting through the darkness. For a moment, they were blinded by the light, unsure if what they were seeing was real. But as the car pulled closer, they saw a figure emerge, a tall man with broad shoulders, bundled up in winter gear. The children froze in fear. Was this man a danger, or their salvation? James Thornton approached the kids cautiously, his heart pounding. Who were these children? And what were they doing out here in the middle of nowhere? He could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else: relief. He knew they had no chance of surviving the storm if they stayed out any longer. Without hesitation, he waved them toward his car. "Come on, I'll take you somewhere safe," he said, his deep voice reassuring them. The children didn't hesitate for long. They were too cold, too scared, and too tired to question his offer. They piled into the warmth of his SUV, huddling together, shivering, as the heat from the car's vents slowly began to thaw their frozen bodies. James looked over them in the rearview mirror, his mind racing. What were 4 children doing out here, alone in such a dangerous storm? He had so many questions, but for now, his priority was getting them to safety. As the car made its way back to Thornton's grand estate, the snowstorm only seemed to worsen. The wind howled louder, the snow came down heavier, but inside the car, there was a fragile sense of calm. The children, though still frightened, began to trust their rescuer. Sarah, the eldest, spoke up quietly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "We didn't know what to do. We were so scared." James nodded, but said nothing. He was still trying to make sense of the situation. Who were these kids? Where were their parents? Why were they out in such dangerous conditions? As they pulled up to his sprawling cabin, he knew he was about to get some answers. The moment they stepped inside, the warmth of the fire engulfed them, and the kids looked around, wide-eyed at the sheer size of the place. Thornton's home was more like a mansion, with high ceilings, modern decor, and large windows that overlooked the snow-covered mountains. It was the kind of place most people could only dream of. But for the kids, it felt surreal. James quickly got to work, lighting more fires, bringing them blankets, and preparing hot cocoa. As they sipped their drinks, the children began to open up, explaining how they had gotten lost after a family ski trip had gone terribly wrong. Their parents had told them to wait in a safe spot while they went for help, but the kids had panicked and wandered off, getting separated in the storm. James listened intently, his concern growing. Where were their parents now? Did they even know their kids were missing? Just as things were beginning to calm down, James heard a noise outside. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again. A loud thud, followed by what sounded like footsteps, crunching through the snow. He glanced out the window, but all he could see was darkness and the relentless snow falling in thick sheets. "Stay here," he told the children, grabbing a flashlight. His heart pounded as he made his way to the front door. The wind slammed against him the moment he stepped outside, but he pressed on, his instincts once again telling him that something wasn't right. And then he saw it. There, in the snow, just beyond the porch, was something. Or someone. James's heart raced as he realized he wasn't alone. James's breath hung in the freezing air as he squinted through the blizzard. His heart pounded. In his chest, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the snow, just enough to make out a figure slumped in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a pile of snow or debris, but the closer he got, the more he realized it wasn't just the storm playing tricks on him. Someone was lying there, half buried in the snow. His boots crunched as he quickened his pace, ignoring the cold biting at his face. As he approached, he saw a man, unconscious, his clothes dusted with snow, face pale and still. Without hesitation, James knelt beside him, shaking him gently. The man didn't stir. His body was cold, dangerously so. James felt panic rising in his chest. He couldn't leave this stranger out here, not in this storm. Grabbing the man under his arms, James dragged him back toward the house, his muscles straining as the wind howled around them. By the time he got the man inside, James was out of breath, but he didn't stop. He quickly laid the stranger down by the fire, rubbing his hands together and trying to warm him up. The children, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, now watched with wide eyes, too scared to ask questions, but sensing the tension in the air. James ran to the kitchen, grabbed blankets, and wrapped the man up as tightly as he could. "Come on, stay with me," he muttered under his breath, hoping the warmth of the fire would be enough to bring the man back. After what felt like forever, the stranger stirred, coughing weakly, his eyes fluttering open. "You're all right," James said softly, relieved. "You're safe now." The man's eyes darted around, confusion and fear evident in his expression. Where am I?" he croaked, his voice raspy and weak. "You're in my home," James explained, kneeling beside him. "You were out in the snow. What happened? How did you end up out there?" The man blinked slowly, his mind struggling to catch up. "The kids," he murmured, glancing over at the 4 children huddled together near the fireplace. "Are they okay?" "They're fine," James assured him. "But I need to know who you are. Were you with them?" The man nodded weakly, his breathing shallow. "I'm their uncle. We got separated in the storm. I tried to find them, but His voice trailed off, and he looked down, clearly shaken. James felt a knot form in his stomach. This was more serious than he had thought. "Your sister and brother-in-law, where are they?" he asked, trying to piece the story together. "They went for help," the man replied. "We were supposed to stay put, but the kids panicked when it got dark, and they wandered off. I went after them, but the storm, it was too much. I got lost too." James rubbed his forehead, the weight of the situation sinking in. The kids were safe for now, but their parents were still out there, somewhere in the storm. The snow was showing no signs of letting up, and the longer their parents were missing, the slimmer the chances of finding them alive. The storm wasn't going to forgive anyone. For a few moments, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The fire crackled in the background, but its warmth did little to ease the tension. James's mind raced, trying to figure out the next step. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing while two people were out there, fighting for their lives in the storm. "I'll call for help," James finally said, grabbing his phone, but as he looked down at the screen, his heart sank. No signal. The storm had knocked out the cell tower in the area. "Of course," he muttered under his breath. The mountains were notorious for bad reception, and tonight was no exception. The children, sensing the growing tension, looked to Sarah, the eldest, for comfort. She squeezed her brother's hand, trying to stay brave. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't have a clear answer, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let the situation spiral further out of control. "We're going to stay calm," he said, his voice steady, despite the growing fear in his chest. "I've got supplies here. We'll be all right for the night." But the truth was, James wasn't sure how long they could wait. The snowstorm was getting worse by the hour, and without any way to contact the outside world, they were completely isolated. If the children's parents didn't make it back soon, they'd have to figure out another plan. The stranger, now sitting up by the fire, glanced at James with concern in his eyes. "There's something else," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. James frowned. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Before we got separated, we noticed something. I'm not sure if it's anything, but we weren't the only ones out there." James's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" "There were tracks," the man explained, his eyes narrowing as he recalled the memory. "Footprints, big ones, but not from animals. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear we were being followed." James's stomach dropped. "Followed? By who?" "I don't know," the man said, shaking his head. "But whatever, or whoever it wasn't friendly." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Something was off, and it wasn't just the snow. His instincts were screaming at him that they were in more danger than they realized. As the wind howled louder outside and the fire flickered in the hearth, James couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Something was out there in the storm. Something watching, waiting. And as the night wore on, the sense of impending danger only grew stronger. The real question was, what or who was out there in the snow, and why were they so interested in this family? The wind outside continued to howl, rattling the windows as the fire flickered weakly in the hearth. The eerie quiet inside the cabin was unnerving, and James could feel the tension building in the room. His eyes kept darting to the front door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. The stranger's words hung heavy in the air. Something was out there, watching them, and the thought gnawed at James's mind. He stood up, grabbing the flashlight again. "I'm going to check outside," he said, his voice firm but quiet. The children stared at him with wide, fearful eyes, and the stranger tried to sit up, wincing from the pain in his body. "Are you sure?" the man asked, worry etched on his face. James nodded, not wanting to scare anyone but knowing he couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut. "I won't go far, just to see if there's any sign of your sister or brother-in-law or anything else." Without waiting for a response, James zipped up his coat and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, the wind whipping snow into his face. His flashlight beam was weak against the swirling snow, but he pushed forward, scanning the ground for tracks or any signs of life. The stranger's words echoed in his head. Footprints, big ones, not from animals. His heart raced as he reached the edge of the clearing, where the snow-covered trees stood like silent sentinels. For a moment, all he could hear was the howling wind, but then he froze. There, in the snow, barely visible, were footprints. They were large, human-like, but uneven, as if whoever made them was dragging something or someone. James crouched down, his breath catching in his throat. These tracks were fresh, and they led deeper into the woods, away from the cabin. A sense of dread settled over him, and he knew he couldn't follow them alone. He quickly turned back toward the house, his mind racing. Whatever had made those tracks was close, too close. As he reached the cabin, his heart pounded even louder. The door was slightly ajar, snow drifting in through the crack. James's stomach dropped. He hadn't left it open. He rushed inside, calling out, "Sarah! Kids!" But the cabin was silent. His eyes darted around the room. The children and the stranger were gone. The blankets where they had been sitting crumpled on the floor. Panic surged through him as he noticed the back door, barely visible from where he stood, was wide open. He ran through it into the backyard, where the snow had covered the ground in a thick layer. His flashlight beam bounced frantically as he searched for any sign of them. Then he saw it. More tracks, leading away from the house, into the same direction as the ones in the woods. He followed them, his breath coming in quick bursts, heart pounding in his chest. It didn't take long before he saw them, Sarah and the children, huddled together in the snow, shivering, their faces pale with fear. The stranger stood in front of them, his body tense, staring into the woods. "What happened?" James called out, rushing to their side. The stranger turned to him, his face grim. "We saw it," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I don't know what it was, but it's watching us." James's blood ran cold. "Where?" The man pointed. "To the trees." And for a brief moment, James saw something. A figure, just barely visible through the snow, standing still, watching them. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was large, its silhouette looming ominously in the distance. James felt a surge of protectiveness as he stepped in front of the children, his body tense. But before he could say anything, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, back into the woods, disappearing into the storm. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, none of them spoke, too shaken to process what had just happened. James turned to the stranger, his mind racing. "What was that?" "I don't know," the man admitted, his voice trembling. "But it's gone now. We need to get back inside, now." Without arguing, James hurried the children and the man back to the cabin, bolting the door behind them. The fire had nearly died down, but James quickly stoked it back to life, casting the room in a flickering, warm glow. They sat in silence for a while, huddled together by the fire, the storm still raging outside. James's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Whatever had been out there, watching them, was gone, for now, but the memory of its silhouette lingered in his mind. A chilling reminder of the unknown dangers that lurked. In the storm, finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice small and shaky. "Do you think it'll come back?" James looked at her, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But we're safe here for now. The storm will pass, and we'll figure out what to do next." The children huddled closer, seeking comfort in each other as the fire crackled softly. James glanced at the stranger, who gave him a nod of quiet understanding. They had made it through the night, but whatever mysteries the storm held, it had left them with more questions than answers. As the wind howled outside, James couldn't help but reflect on how fragile their safety had been. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness, they were just small specks against the forces of nature and something more. But for now, they were together, and that was all that mattered. And as the snowstorm raged on, one thing became clear. Sometimes, it wasn't just the storm you had to survive.